All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this astrology forecast workshop. It's really beautiful to be able to gather with all of you and talk about what is here and what's going to be coming up in this next month or this next lunation cycle. And first let me introduce myself if you weren't here last time. My name's Becca Tarnas, and I'm a counseling archetypal astrologer. And I am going to be sharing with you an overview of what is happening in terms of the planetary alignments through this next month, through the next lunation cycle. And just get right down to basic terminology. The word month, you can hear in the word itself, it has that moon within it. The length of a month is based on the length of a lunar cycle. But the way that you'll notice, we have 12 months in the solar year, in the solar calendar, and we actually get about 13 lunations that fit within that roughly. So it doesn't line up exactly. So we don't have like the new moon on the first day of the month. We don't have the full moon at the middle. That would be very convenient. But we don't exist in a culture that uses a lunar calendar. There are cultures that do still use a lunar calendar. And so it's really interesting to see when those intersect. But presuming I'm speaking to many people in California and in the States and, maybe further abroad, but a lot of us use the solar calendar. And so that is why, even though it isn't the beginning of June, we are approaching the beginning of a new lunation. So that's the difference between the month and the lunation and what we're looking ahead at. Some astrologers will do a forecast for the month, so all of April, all of May, all of June, but I prefer to orient toward that lunar-based cycle. So we're going to be looking at the Gemini lunation. And just yesterday, the sun moved into the sign of Gemini, and it will be there for 1 month. It'll be there until it moves into Cancer on, let me see, do I have that date right in front of me? It's going to be somewhere around June. Oh, right, of course. That's a very potent day. It happens on June 20th, and it happens to align with the new moon, the next new moon, and the solar eclipse. So the structure of what I'm going to be sharing today is I'm going to start off with the lunation cycle and go through the dates of each of the major phases in the cycle. So beginning with the new moon, which is tomorrow. And the new moon is when the sun and the moon come into what's called a conjunction, where they're visibly next to each other in the sky. And then, well, it's not actually visible because the new moon disappears into the light of the sun. And then we'll be looking at the quarter moon, which is when they're at a 90-degree angle to each other, or what is called a square in astrology. And then we're going to be looking at the full moon, which happens to be a lunar eclipse this month. So we're talking about some pretty potent energies happening in this cycle. Lunar eclipse, that's the opposition, 180-degree angle. That's the full moon. Then we're going to be looking at the waning square. That is, again, a 90-degree angle. And then finally closing out that cycle with the next new moon, which is a solar eclipse. So we are entering eclipse season. We haven't been in eclipse season since the end of last year, beginning of this year. There was a solar eclipse on December 25th, so on Christmas of 2019. And then it's paired lunar eclipse because they come in pairs. That just like a sacred marriage, they come in pairs, and you get the lunar eclipse was January 10th. So this is the first set of eclipses since that since those dates in the winter. And the reason I want to start off with looking at the lunation cycle before really weaving in other transits is because this is kind of like our scaffolding. It's something that you can really ground yourself into and get a sense for the rhythm that's unfolding. So you have the new moon, the waxing quarter, full moon, waning quarter, new moon. It's a nice cycle that you're tracking throughout the month. And there are different ways to work with it. The interesting thing with astrology is that it's both descriptive, so what's going to happen. You can speak about that more concretely. You can speak about that in a more in an archetypal sense. What's going to happen in terms of the range of qualities that may come through. That's the perspective I generally take. And so it's descriptive, but it also can be prescriptive. How can you participate in these energies? How can you consciously engage in what the transits are? So it's not just happening to you, but also you have the opportunity to step in and engage more fully with the archetypal qualities that are present. So that's what we're looking at, both sides. The possibility of having an idea of what may unfold and how to better live in relationship to that. And that participatory side is not so much, getting to know what the transits are so that you can have a sense of control over it. It's more of a getting to know what the weather is before you go out sailing or before you go out surfing. You want to know what the conditions are so that you can best adapt to it. But it isn't necessarily about knowing everything so that you can control all possible outcomes. The universe is far too creative for that to be able to happen anyway. The trickster usually shows up and does something or other that undermines our best laid plans. So it's more about shifting how we view our relationship. And instead of feeling like we are puppets being moved by the strings of these archetypal forces, rather we can see ourselves becoming dance partners and learning how to dance with the different planetary archetypes as they move through our lives and we move through theirs. So it is a relationship. So we'll be looking with that structure of the lunation cycle. And then I'll be kind of weaving into that a little bit, but also saving a bit more for the latter part of our time together to look at the other transits that are happening. For example, there's a few important retrogrades that are taking place, most of which have already started, but one which will start later in the cycle. And also just a few other really important planetary alignments that are taking place. Now, if you were here last month, you would have heard me talk about the largest overarching transit that's really dominating the year, and that is the Jupiter-Saturn-Pluto stellium in Capricorn. It's in Capricorn and bridging into Aquarius because Saturn's hanging out in Aquarius right now, but it's coming back into Capricorn by the beginning of July. And that, I'm not going to go too much into that because I went into it last time. And if you've worked with me before, you've probably heard me talk a lot about that Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto stellium. But there is a video of last month if this is your first time here joining us, so you can catch up a little bit on that. But I do want to just say, because this is the larger umbrella transit of what's happening, that's really contextualizing all of what's going on within these shorter time periods that we're going to be focusing on for the month. So that larger context of Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, Saturn, Pluto alignments in particular tend to correlate with crises, with contractions, with major challenges, and Jupiter tends to amplify that, to globalize it. And where do we find ourselves? In the midst of a global pandemic. So if we look through history, we can see every time Saturn and Pluto come together, there tend to be rather challenging events that correlate with it, whether it's the start of both of the world wars or 9/11 or the AIDS epidemic under the last Saturn-Pluto conjunction in the early 80s, or going back centuries, the bubonic plague, first starting in China under a Saturn-Pluto alignment, and then spreading through Europe under the next Saturn-Pluto alignment. So you can see difficult things tend to happen under Saturn-Pluto, but it's not all bad, because challenge forges something in us. It calls us to really step up to meet what the challenges are. And so there's a capacity that gets forged within us to gain the strength, the tenacity to look very honestly and in a real way at whatever it is that's happening. In this case, this year, this particular alignment, it's a pandemic, it's an economic collapse, it's really intense political divisions, and many other things that we could list out. So if you're wanting to know more about that, I do have other videos talking specifically about that, or I can even point you toward other resources of other wonderful astrologers who are talking about that, because that's kind of the main theme of what's going on. So we have to hold that in the back of our minds, that we are within this big transformative facing the shadow period. Now, zooming in a little bit more from that, let's look at our lunation cycle. And I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can all see this. And I will mention, by the way, that if you have any questions that come up about any of this, because I know that there's varying levels of astrological understanding. Astrology is a language, astrologos, and maybe you're really new to learning this language, and half of what I'm saying is just flying over your head. And maybe some of you are experts in this field, and so everything I'm saying is just kind of a practical thing to get a different person's perspective on. But I want to try and cater to the whole range, and so please feel free to ask questions at any point. You can either put your hand up, there's a little raise hand function, or you can put your question in the chat and I'll loop back to it as soon as I can. All questions are welcome. There's no such thing as a stupid question here, because even if someone knows the answer to it, they may get a further illumination into one person's understanding of what that answer might be. So this is a learning space. All right, let me share my screen and we can look at the transits right now, today. Can you all see that? Wonderful, I'm seeing some nods. So what we have here, these are where the planets are right now as we're speaking. And what I want to draw your attention to, this is your first time looking at a chart, this is based on where I am right now in Nevada City. So it's kind of like I'm sitting right here, and maybe some of you also are sitting right about here. And this line is the horizon line, cutting through that horizontally. So it's like a cross section. And everything above that line is at this moment up in the apparent dome of the sky above us. And so here's the sun. And you can see that the sun is in the sign of Gemini. That's what this glyph is. So the sun moved into Gemini yesterday. And the sun will be in Gemini for 1 month. And you can see that Gemini has several other planets in it too. Mercury is in there. Venus is in there. You'll notice that with the red numbering there, it means Venus is retrograde, which we'll be talking about shortly. And here's the moon. And you can see that the moon, which is in Taurus right now as we're speaking, is heading toward the sun. So that's because tomorrow is the new moon. And when we arrive at tomorrow, let me make sure I have the right time. There we go. You'll see there's the new moon. The moon will have moved into Gemini and there will be that exact conjunction. So that's the new moon. And to give you a sense for the qualities of this new moon and the sun in Gemini. Well, Gemini, which is often called the sign of the twins, Gemini is a Mercury ruled sign. And it's an air sign. It's what's called a mutable air sign. So mutable is when it comes at the end of the season. So it's changing into the next season. We're at that in the northern hemisphere, the end of spring, changing towards summer. And it has this kind of airy, mental, intellectual quality to it. So a lot of the themes that are associated with Gemini have to do with themes that we archetypally associate with the planet Mercury as well, because Mercury grants its qualities to the sign that it rules. And so themes of communication, speaking, language, thinking, writing, learning. So it's a rather intellectual month. It's a rather conversational month. A lot of dialogue taking place. And there's so much, as you can see, tomorrow at the new moon, there is a lot that is in Gemini. The sun, the moon, Venus, Mercury, they're all just packed in there. And actually the North Node just went back into Gemini as well, for those of you that means something to. So you can see it's very full. Mercury's in there, and it's kind of like Mercury is hosting a gathering. There's something very social and conversational about this collection of planets in such a talkative sign. And it's these themes of communication, of language, of our thought patterns also. These will be at the fore during the lunation, really paying attention to how you think, how you speak to yourself, how you talk to others, what you make note of. And some questions that could come up around this are, how do the words that you choose and the ways that you communicate, how do they tend to your relationships? How do they tend to your dreams, to your ideals? And the reason I'm bringing that in is because Mercury, now I'm kind of stepping away from the lunation pattern for a second. Mercury is making an exact square tomorrow, a 90-degree angle to Neptune. And Neptune is the principle of the visionary, the dream, the imagination, fantasy, spirituality, the soul, religion. It's symbolized by water. It's very flowing and merging. And so with all of these planets in Mercury's sign, and Mercury and Venus square to Neptune, all of this Neptunian kind of watery, dreamy energy is flowing in. And it's particularly flowing in through the mental processes, but it's also flowing in through the heart. I'm going to bracket that one a little bit because I'm going to come back and talk more about what Venus is doing this month. But with the new moon, one of those prescriptive ways you can work with it, some people work with it in terms of using the new moon to set intentions. And I'll bring this up every lunation cycle, every month, that being able to take that new moon period, the darkness of the new moon, it's like planting a seed in the darkness below the soil. And whatever intentions, whatever it is you want to grow this month, tomorrow is the time to set it in terms of a ritual orientation to that. And you may want to keep in mind that when you set that intention, the mind will be present because it's a Gemini lunation, because it's a Mercury ruled sign. And because Mercury is at home right now there too. So just certain things that you can sit with as you approach the new moon tomorrow and think about, what seeds do you want to plant? So moving forward now from the new moon to the first quarter moon, or what's called the waxing quarter moon, where you see it half lit. And make sure I get the right quarter moon. So the quarter moon happens on May 29th. And the moon will have moved from Gemini over to Virgo by then. Now, this is kind of interesting because Mercury rules 2 signs in the zodiac. And besides Gemini, its other sign is Virgo. So this waxing quarter, you get both luminaries, and luminaries is a word that's used to describe the sun and the moon together because they illuminate our skies. That first waxing quarter, it has both the sun and the moon in a Mercury ruled sign. So really, once again, I am emphasizing that the themes of this month, not just because of Gemini, but also that first waxing quarter, they're all going to be about Mercury. Now, Virgo is an earth sign rather than an air sign, but it is still mutable and ruled by Mercury. So there's a lot in common between Gemini and Virgo, but you have that difference of the airiness of Gemini and the weightier, heavier earthiness of Virgo. And there's a little bit of tension between these two, even though they do have so much in common. The reason there's tension is the difference of those elements, air versus earth. So squares, that opening waxing square or quarter, can have a little bit of tension within it. And it could be certain themes, again, around communication, words, the words you choose, how you show up in relational communication, that may have a little bit of an edge to it, may grate in some ways because you're bringing contradictory elements together. The other important piece here is that the moon is at the same moment that it makes this exact square to the sun that you can see, it's making an exact trine to Uranus. And Uranus is the archetype of change, awakening, liberation, freedom. Uranus is the trickster. It's the rebel. It awakens, it liberates, it innovates. It has that kind of spark of rebel genius quality to it. It has an adolescent element to it. And when you have the moon coming into this exact trine to Uranus at the same time as the square to the sun or the quarter moon, there may be these feelings of restlessness that arise, of feeling the need for change. I have a feeling we're all kind of feeling that in general because of this larger context of the Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, which can feel very heavy, very entrapping, very constricting. This may be one of the days within the lunation cycle where that's especially felt. It's felt at an emotional level. And why is that? Because the moon is the archetype of the emotions. The moon is the archetype of the feelings, our embodied experience, our intimate home, family, relational dynamics. So in that inner sphere, where are you feeling restless? Where are you feeling a need for change, to break out? There's a bit of a, it's not so tension oriented that it's like the need for change where you just suddenly break out and kind of break down things, because it has that harmonious angle of the trine. But there's still going to be that kind of restlessness, kind of an erratic relationship to emotions of like, I'm feeling this and now I'm feeling that, and feel kind of thrown off, and it has that kind of jumpy quality to it. But it can also be very playful. That's a fun thing about the moon with Uranus. It's a playful transit, and it allows us to tap into a more childlike state of consciousness. So as we're moving through to this quarter moon, we have this kind of restless yet playful change-oriented energy coming in on that particular day. So moving to the next station of our lunation cycle, now we're coming to the opposition, also known as the full moon. And my goodness, we have such a potent full moon here. So the full moon is in Sagittarius. The moon finds itself in the fiery mutable sign that's ruled by Jupiter. So it's a very expansive sign. It has a lot of energy to it, an adventurous quality to it. And the moon is in this opposition to the sun. That's what the full moon is. And under normal circumstances, the full moon when you look up at it in the sky, it's fully illuminated. The moon is the brightest that it's going to be during the month. And you can really feel that level of energy. Normally, there's a lot of different correlations where whether it's police stations or hospitals reporting greater activity under full moons, everything is a bit more awake because the daylight has come into the nighttime. And you can really feel that amongst animals, and maybe even, I mean, I notice personally, I have trouble sleeping under the full moon. It's harder to get to sleep when the light of the sun has entered into the night world. But this full moon is special because it is a lunar eclipse. And what happens with a lunar eclipse, you can just get astronomical for a moment, is that the Earth, when we have a full moon, you have the moon on one side of the Earth and you have the sun on the other. But at particular points in the year, that alignment is so exact that the planetary orb of the Earth blocks the light of the sun from reaching the moon. And so it can't be illuminated. So it's a full moon that should be bright, but it's dark. And not only is it dark, it's often blood red because we're seeing it through the shadow of the Earth. The Earth itself is casting a shadow on the moon, and we're seeing it through our atmosphere as well. So it's got this kind of bloody reddish quality. It's very eerie. And traditionally, eclipses, both solar and lunar, were viewed as being malefic, as being negative. And because the light is hidden, and it gives us this eerie feeling that something is wrong, something isn't right here. And while I do feel there is certainly validity, and I have experienced it personally as well, and I'm accumulating my own personal research around that more malefic side of eclipses, there's something that we can hold in mind coming out of, for example, a depth psychological perspective, that the darkness doesn't always mean that it's bad or that it's negative. The loss of the light means that we have to look into the darkness, and we have to see by its own light. We have to see by its own consciousness. And as depth psychologists such as C.G. Jung or James Hillman and others working within that field have brought forward, it's not only important, but actually essential to our wholeness and flourishing to look into that darkness within ourselves, to face the shadow. That's what the larger Saturn-Pluto context is all about as well. We're getting a concentration of it here with these eclipses. And so what I want to suggest is, well, there is this malefic or more negative tinge to the eclipse, to the lunar eclipse. It's also an opportunity. Maybe don't hold the ritual in which you set intentions and capture positive energy during that time. That's not really going to work out. It's not about doing what you do at the new moon. It's more about going deeply inward, becoming introspective, and really looking into the depths of yourself. Now, this is an extremely potent full moon. And let me show you why. Not only is it a full moon, not only is it an eclipse, but it's making a T-square with Mars, an exact T-square with Mars. And Venus is really close by. It's within 3 degrees. Neptune's actually within 5 degrees. So you can see this is what's called a T-square configuration, where you've got that opposition in the middle, and then you have these squares, and it makes a T. If I draw that line there, that's the T part of it. So those 90-degree angles and then that 120-degree. That is a very potent alignment. It has this tension within it. You've got the tension of opposites of the full moon, and then it has this kind of perpendicular pillar that's cutting through in the middle as well. So a very kind of tension-oriented, powerful, potent alignment between all of these planets. So what is going to be coming into this opposition, into the full moon, but Mars? And Mars is the warrior. Mars is fire and energy and action and the will to do. It's the athlete. It's anger. It can be violence. It's assertion. It's aggression. And so Mars coming in at these hard angles to the sun and the moon is going to bring a lot of that Martian energy into what blossoms at this dark full moon. So when you're in your introspective space, you may be looking at some anger. You may be looking at some of those more fiery places. You may be looking at the warrior within you. And sometimes the warrior can be really scary when it's wielding a sword. The warrior also can defend. It can be defensive, or it can defend what is right, what matters. So this is part of what's coming through at this particular full moon lunar eclipse. And then finally, with Venus in there too, your heart gets involved. Venus is the heart. It's love, it's romance, it's relationship, it's beauty. And so the image that I've kind of been holding around this whole complex configuration, we could honestly spend the rest of our time just talking about this one day, is that when you're going into that introspective space and you're looking at the depths of your being, I think it's really about looking into the fiery depths of your heart, because that's what's being activated here. With Venus and Mars, it's those, it's the fiery heart, it's the passionate, erotic, creative center of our being. And so to have that activated during a lunar eclipse, during the full moon, it's a very potent time. So going on from there, we're going to next come to our waning square. And that one's going to be taking place. So the full moon was June 5th, and then it's June 12th that we have the waning quarter. And each of these alignments, of course, takes place in a mutable sign. That's whatever sign the sun is in. If it's mutable in this case versus cardinal or fixed, then all of the hard aspects to it will be, in this case, mutable. Or the end of the season sign, the changing season. That's what mutable means. It means changing. So this too, this closing square is also really complex because, again, there are multiple other planets involved. You can see the moon here swept over Mars and Neptune before making its square to the sun. They're all very close. And Moon, Mars, Neptune is a really interesting combination of planetary archetypes because, again, the moon, it's our feelings, it's our emotions, it's our intimate relational connections, like the people you live with, your family, your parents, your children, your partner, if you've been together long enough and they go from being the Venusian lover to being the lunar partner. The moon is that inner domestic world. And then Mars, as I was just describing, it has that more assertive, potentially aggressive, often kind of more angry element to it. And I don't mean to paint Mars all in a bad light. Obviously, anger is vitally important. And Mars is what gives us the will to take action, the will to do anything, what gets us going. So Mars is absolutely necessary to get literally anything done. But then you have them here with Neptune. And on this day of the waning quarter moon, Mars and Neptune make their exact alignment. I think it actually might be the next day. Yeah, it's June 13th that they really touch in exact. But two planets like this is dominating the month. So I'm going to be talking more about this This Mars-Neptune conjunction is, it's an energy that's really filling the field of this lunation cycle, because of how long it takes with Mars coming in, crossing it, and then moving out. And so Neptune, it's quite watery. So you can see Mars and Neptune are really contrary archetypes. Mars is the fire, and Neptune is the watery idealism. When you bring them together, sometimes Neptune can have the effect of kind of making Mars diffuse, making it softer, making it more permeable. It's like we have a leaky valve on our energy. So you may actually feel through some of this longer transit of Mars with Neptune, maybe you have less energy. There's less vital energy that you can access. Or if you can access it, like even physical energy, if you can access it, it might only be in the context of more kind of soft flowing expressions of energy. And some examples of that just to offer are, if Mars is the athlete, it's that physical energy within us. Neptune brings in flow and spirituality. So practices can be one of the best expressions of Mars Neptune. Practices such as yoga and Tai Chi and Qigong, things that work with energy and spirituality and the physical body. That helps bring this fire-water combination into harmony. And it's a way of kind of directing your energy rather than feeling like, oh, it's just leaking away. It's leaking away. And we can be a little bit more, I think this is a bit more the case if one's getting this as a personal transit, but it certainly could be the case, especially considering current conditions, that with Mars Neptune, we can be a little bit more susceptible to infection, to getting sick, because our energy's down. Our immune system can be lower under Mars Neptune. And again, with Neptune being kind of leaky, there's that leaky boundary quality to it where we can get more susceptible. So that's something to keep in mind there of how do you direct your energy? How do you work with it so it doesn't feel like it's just getting washed away by Neptune? So on this day of the waning quarter moon, the moon is going to be moving through that. And so it brings Mars Neptune into our emotional relational sphere. And under a transit like this, so it'll last for the day, we can feel more kind of sensitive, but also prickly. It's like we have no skin on. We're just very easily permeated, even feeling like penetrated by the outside world. So simultaneously feeling very sensitive, but also like we have an edge to us. One kind of metaphor that comes up for me is that we can be like an emotional jellyfish. And if we get pushed the wrong way, then we're likely to sting and sting unconsciously, and maybe somebody who's close with us. So Moon, Mars, Neptune, the emotional, prickly jellyfish kind of creature. And again, being able to direct some of that energy toward practice, toward something that feels more physically embodied, but also spiritually mindful if you can. Because Mars-Neptune's the spiritual warrior. And at its highest potential, it has that ability to take action, that's Mars, on behalf of Neptune, our ideals, our visions, our dreams, our larger spiritual context. And so there's a great nobility to Mars Neptune if we can find that energy and direct it toward these Neptunian ideals. So that takes place June 12th, 13th. That kind of bridges between those days because, as you can see, it happens very late on June 12th, so basically crossing into the 13th. And as I mentioned, that Mars-Neptune is really going to be there throughout this whole month. So everything I just described about Mars-Neptune, from the jellyfish to the spiritual warrior, is rather applicable. But I think you'll feel it more when the moon is there, when the moon is in Pisces, when the moon is crossing over it, because that's what the moon makes us do. It makes us feel things in our embodied center. So finally, moving to the last stage in this cycle, we come to the next new moon, which is right here. And so this new moon is taking place right at the beginning of Cancer. And the sun will have slipped into Cancer, this cardinal water sign, which marks the beginning of summer. So it's the summer solstice that's taking place on June 20th. And it's the sun enters Cancer and marks the beginning of summer. We've moved out of the mutable sign to the cardinal sign. So cardinal signs start the seasons, they initiate, but Cancer is a water sign. It's the one sign that is ruled by the moon. So it has that, everything I've been describing about the moon, it has that emotional, relational, watery, maternal element to it. Cancer does. And so having the new moon in this very watery, almost womb-like sign, like the amniotic fluid, we're going to be bathed in that energy. But just like the full moon being a lunar eclipse, this new moon is a solar eclipse. So it makes it all the more potent. And you can keep in mind a lot of the things I said earlier about eclipses that are applicable both to the lunar and to the solar eclipse. And so, speaking astronomically again, when we have a solar eclipse, you have both the sun and the moon on the same side of the earth, and this time it's the moon passing in front of the sun and blocking out its light. And here in California, at least, as you can see, it's going to be happening at 11:41 p.m., so it's the middle of the night. So here, at least, we won't be seeing it. If you're on the other side of the world, there is the possibility of seeing it. And just speaking about eclipses in general, even if they do have this more, you could say, malefic, sometimes negative, definitely shadowy expression, and of course that makes sense, the light is being hidden, they're also extraordinarily beautiful. And if you ever have the opportunity to bear witness to an eclipse, it is one of the most sacred, numinous cosmic events that we have the extraordinary privilege of seeing. Because what are the chances that from where we are on this earth, when we look at these two completely different size bodies, the sun and the moon, and one is so much closer to us, and the other so much further away, and yet because of their relative size and relative distance, when they come together, they're the same size, and that the little moon can block out the fullness of the sun. There is something so extraordinarily beautiful and deeply meaningful about the fact that an eclipse is possible, that if astrology wasn't enough, it points toward some deeper intelligence to this cosmos, something beyond the human being, but really a cosmic intelligence and even care that we can perceive. And we can perceive that with the transits. We can perceive that in general when we pay attention to all the wisdom astrology offers us. But there's something about just that physical expression of seeing the solar eclipse in particular that just brings home a sense of wonder and awe that is truly amazing. So the symbolism that's coming together here with this new moon, that it's the solstice, that so it's the beginning of summer, and yet with the light being blocked out, it's like this moment of winter entering in at the beginning of summer. And I think that's the larger interplay that we're experiencing right now between light and shadow, and finding that during time periods that we think everything should be light and open and beautiful, actually it feels really dark and heavy. And again, that's reflective as well of this larger Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto context that we're in, that I keep referring back to, that we are in this heavy, deep, transformative time, a time of contraction. So that alignment, the solar eclipse and the new moon at the beginning of Cancer, that will end this cycle that we've been talking about, and it will initiate the next one. We'll be having this same gathering before that happens, so I'll be touching on that again, going more into the themes of that. But it is what brings this particular cycle to a close. I have several other transits that I want to focus in on, to just unpack, that are going to be happening within this lunation cycle. But I want to pause and take a moment to see if there are any questions. I'm just seeing one question that popped up of, will we be able to see the eclipse in California? And alas, we won't be able to. It's happening in the middle of the night for us. I know it'll be basically on the other side of the earth that it'll be visible. I haven't looked up which locations usually, which, if there are any land locations. Often eclipses are only visible from the sea. And when they are visible from land, you really hear about it because everyone's migrating to be able to go see them. So I'm just wondering, does anyone have any thoughts, any questions? What are the differences and similarities in mercurial qualities between Gemini and Virgo? Laura, thank you for that question. It's a great question. So the differences are really based on the difference of the element of those two signs. So they're both, as I mentioned, mutable signs. So they're both coming at the end of their seasons. One comes at the end of spring, one comes at the end of summer. So they're both oriented toward change in that way. But the really big difference is the air of Gemini versus the earth of Virgo. And Gemini has more of if you put Mercury in the air, and even mythologically, if you think about Mercury or Hermes, it's this figure who has a winged cap. He has wings on his sandals, and he's very much a being of the air. Mercury, I just said he there, speaking mythologically, but Mercury traditionally is seen as a hermaphroditic. That's even where we get hermaphroditic, the Hermes in the first part of that, both male and female kind of figure. And so Gemini more has the quality of like airy social conversation. And it's a bit more talkative. It's more about the interaction. And it's going to be, I think we're especially going to feel that because Venus is retrograde right now. This is one of the retrogrades I wanted to go more into. Venus is retrograde in Gemini. So Venus, which is all about relationship, heart and love and beauty, it's in this kind of talkative social sign. So I think through this month, we're really going to be seeing a lot of relationships being maintained mostly through talking, through a verbal orientation. And that really makes sense considering the context that we're in of, I mean, how many of us have had about 10,000 Zoom calls, and all of our relationships are being maintained through video chat and texting and email, and it's all very talky. And there's a little bit of with that airiness, there's a lightness to it. Turn to Virgo, and Virgo is an earth sign, and so it has a heaviness to it. And whereas the mercurial expression of Gemini seems to be more relational, and communicative. I mean, even think of like the twins talking to each other. Virgo is it's actually I just realized something, which I'll tell you in a moment, that just clicked for me. But Virgo, with that earth sign, it's more logical, it's more structured, it's more organized. So rather than the communication between, it's more about the mental processes and how to think things through in a clear way, in a logical way. It's being met with a bit of the resistance and heaviness that earth brings. And you can see that in a lot of the qualities we associate with Virgo, where it's very structured, very organized, everything's precise and kind of set in its right place. The realization I just had in this moment is that Gemini, as the twins, it's two human figures, and they're talking to each other. They're usually facing each other and in dialogue. Whereas Virgo, as the virgin in the original sense of that word, the meaning of that word doesn't mean one who isn't sexually initiated. It means she who is one unto herself. And what just clicked for me is that difference between the two of Gemini and the dialogue versus Virgo as that Ouroboros, kind of turning in on itself, being one with itself. The conversation is happening internally to her very being. And so it stays within its own bounds. It stays grounded in that way. And that's the other big theme with Virgo, is that it's the sign of the harvest. It's the last sign of that the sun moves through at the end of summer. And so we think of it, you see the Virgo's virgin with the sheaves of wheat, with the abundance that's being brought in. So you can kind of think of the two mercurial qualities between Gemini and Virgo as what gets opened up in the conversation between two. All the ideas flying around, moving through the air like butterflies, and then bringing it all back home with Virgo. That's the end of the conversation. It's wrapping things up. It's harvesting the ideas that have been opened up in this summer season. Anyway, so those are some thoughts on the differences between Virgo and Gemini, but you can see what they have at the heart of it is Mercury. Mercury is at home in both places. And Mercury, interestingly, even though it rules both, it's exalted in Virgo. So it's the only planet that is both ruling and exalted in the same sign. Usually it's exalted, a planet will be exalted in a different sign than one that it rules. So for example, like the moon is exalted in Taurus, which is ruled by Venus. To be exalted is to be like the honored guest in the home of whoever is ruling the sign. So Mercury in Virgo is kind of like the honored guest in its own home. And I kind of see that as it's a going out from the home at the beginning of Gemini season, and then it's coming back home as this kind of celebrated wanderer who comes back in. Mercury's ability to traverse worlds. It's the only one, mythologically speaking, Mercury is the only one who can go to the underworld and back and go to the heavens. So traversing all three worlds of the heavenly, the hell realm, and the middle world. So that's our little homage to Mercury and to Hermes. Does anyone else have any questions before I throw in a few more transits that are happening this month? Yes, I see a hand raised. Oh, and I think I saw a notice. Yeah, Constance, great.
Hi. I
Hi.
was thinking about what you were saying about the full moon
Yeah.
and the qualities of the full moon and the intention setting we might do at the new moon.
Mm.
Maybe you could say a few words about how we might let the what's coming in the full moon inform the direction we take with that.
That's a great question. And what I would say is knowing that the full moon is kind of ideally going to be about going inward and almost buffering yourself, the being able to hold yourself in like a womb-like space, which is very different than what we think of with the full moon. That's usually the blossoming, it's the birthing. So in setting those intentions, what I would look to certain themes of what do you want to have grow, but in an inward way. So it's not so much about growing outward, it's about growing down. It's about um, going more deeply into yourself. And I have kind of multiple different streams of thought coming in here, because if I was just answering this abstractly for setting an intention for an upcoming lunar eclipse full moon, then I would say exactly what I just said of that that intention of growing down, growing inward. What James Hillman, drawing on the Romantic poet John Keats, actually says of soul making, going in towards soul making. It isn't about lifting out to the spirit, it's going deep into the soul and doing the work there. But with the other conditions that are present here, particularly Venus retrograde in Gemini, and Venus being involved, and Mars being involved in that T square that I showed you earlier, that's going to bring up relational dynamics and relational tensions. So on June 2nd, so 3 days before the full moon, Venus is going to make an exact square to Mars. And Venus and Mars are the lovers. Venus is what's beautiful and what attracts in, and is the what's alluring, and so on. And Mars is assertion and desire, and that kind of more testosterone driven phallic energy. I don't want to land Venus is feminine and Mars is masculine, because we have both within us, but it's more of a beautiful attraction versus a fiery assertion. And they're going to be at that angle of a square, so a 90-degree angle to each other. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of tension in a 90-degree angle. So when you have Venus square to Mars, is going to be exact on June 2nd, will be very present in this eclipse, because the eclipse will be crossing it. That can indicate friction and tension, particularly between lovers or with loved ones. So it can be the fight with the loved one, it can be the argument, it can be the disagreement about something that your heart is involved in, something that you really care about, that you love. But with that tension, as we all know, tension births friction, and friction has an erotic quality to it. So it's both the fight and the makeup sex. And okay, we could take that quite literally, but we could also take that symbolically, that it's tension that then resolves into a new creative dynamism. So all of that is going to be there in this eclipse too. And just imagining one sequence, that kind of dynamic creative tension is building in the days before the eclipse. Then the eclipse comes in, and maybe what it is that has been kind of opened up with the Venus Mars, that's what you need to take back in and go reflect on. Maybe it's really reflecting on those relationship dynamics. Maybe it's really looking at, oh, how do I express my anger when I'm upset at somebody that I really love, but they're also driving me up the wall, kind of thing. And that's what you're going to take inward when the eclipse comes around. That's what you're going to sit with, because let's be honest, that's where our shadow shows up too, is in those moments. And if we can get to know that part of ourselves, and not necessarily see it as something that's bad, but just something that we need to learn how to own and integrate. So those are some thoughts.
Mars and their squaring, and Mars conjunct Neptune and squaring everything. Maybe we should just all have a big dance marathon.
Yes, Venus, Mars, absolutely is, and with Neptune bringing in that grace and flow, dance is one of the best expressions for this particular combination. Venus and Mars, they're, as some of you I'm sure have heard me talk about, they're the performers. Like Mars makes Venus, the artist, move. So it's the dancer, it's the musician, it's the person who loves to be on stage. And yet we're holding this in a context where Venus is retrograde and we're all in a Saturn Pluto imprisoning kind of environment. And so again, that may have to take place on a smaller scale, on an inner scale. What was that?
In the living room.
In the living room, which, you know, is a great place to dance.
Yeah, right.
And it's a great way to move that energy through the body as well.
Right.
So yeah, really great question about that, about setting those intentions. Sometimes I find too that even if we consciously set an intention at the new moon, we don't totally understand what it is until the full moon comes around, or even until we're all the way at the balsamic moon, that last closing sextile of the cycle. I'm like, oh, that's what I intended. Okay, that's actually what I set in motion. And so we can kind of reflect back on that too. Again,
you say something kind of general that you intend. I intended this to be resolved, and then the way it gets resolved is more creative and more surprising and more clever than you could have ever imagined.
mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
recognize it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. Does anyone else have any questions? Any further thoughts or your own input as well? Well, a couple other things that I wanted to mention that are happening. We've been talking a lot about Mercury, which makes sense because the sun is moving through Gemini. And Mercury, the actual planet Mercury, will be crossing out of its home sign into Cancer on May 28th. So just next week. And Mercury is actually going to be spending a long time in Cancer. So again, Cancer, it's a water sign, it's a cardinal sign, and it's the only sign ruled by the moon. So Mercury is kind of swimming its way into this sign. And instead of carrying along at a nice clip like it did through Gemini, like it did through Taurus, like it did through Aries in these last several months, Mercury is going to get caught in one of Cancer's tides. So, what that means is that it's going to be going retrograde. And Mercury is going to be spending all the way until August 4th in Cancer. So it's a long time that it's going to be in this water sign. And so it goes retrograde on the 28th of May. And, oh, excuse me, totally wrong information there. It enters Cancer on the 28th of May, carries forward throughout most of this lunation that we've been talking about. And then it goes retrograde late on June 17th. So almost a full month from now. And it'll be retrograde until July 12th. So in the next forecast, a month from now, I will go more into this because we'll actually be speaking very likely on the day that it goes retrograde. But just to know that throughout this month with Mercury in Cancer in the moon sign, these are themes that are going to be present with us for a lot of the summer because of that retrograde motion that will be coming in the middle of June. And so there's a kind of slowing down and a dreamy, emotional, flowing quality that the mercurial mental sphere will start to take on. And I have a feeling that one of the ways this will come through is that with the retrograde, especially, but already with Mercury in that sign, memories might start coming up. The moon, which rules Cancer, is connected to memory. It's connected to our childhood experiences. And that there may be this kind of space of being in reverie, of remembrance, of going back over things. And that will especially be the case during the retrograde period, because that's what happens during retrogrades, where there is that kind of rethinking, reviewing, um, unlearning and relearning kind of quality. You can't push forward under a Mercury retrograde in terms of plans, ideas, travel, etc. It's all about slowing down and reflecting back on things. And with it taking place in this very kind of watery emotional sign, it will be especially oriented toward um, these more intimate subjects, the intimacy of family, home, childhood, emotions, feelings, and so on. So again, Mercury moves into Cancer May 28th. We've got several weeks till it actually goes retrograde, but we're going to be getting a taste of what that will be like because it's in this sign for so long. I imagine that a lot of you already know this, but maybe not. I always like bringing in the astronomical element, because what is a retrograde? A retrograde is when a planet appears to be moving backwards through the sky. And the important piece about this is that it isn't actually moving backwards. The planets carry along their elliptical orbits in one direction only. They just keep going. But we're also on a moving planet. So, based on our speed and direction and the speed of other planets, it may at times appear like those planets are going backwards. It's like when you're on a train and you're going forward and you pass a train next to you that's also going forward, but it's going slower than you. So it looks like it's going backwards. If you've ever had that feeling, it's a very weird feeling. That's what's happening when we see Mercury go retrograde, when we see Venus go retrograde, as happened on May 13th. Venus went retrograde in Gemini. Venus will be retrograde for until June 25th. So I'll be in the next forecast looking at what's happening as Venus goes direct on the 25th. Venus is in Gemini for 4 months, so it's a long time in that Mercury ruled sign. And so with each of these planets, when they go retrograde, it doesn't mean that astronomically they're doing anything different. It means that where we are on our moving planet in relation to that moving planet makes it look like it's going backwards. And it was that motion that led astronomers, ancient astronomers, to think that they didn't have the model right of the cosmos, because it was believed by most people for most of human history that the Earth was at the center. I mean, that makes sense. We don't see it moving. And that all of the other planets were moving around us in perfect circles. And they had to be perfect because the heavens were perfect. They're the moving image of eternity, as Plato said. And yet you have these planets, these wanderers. That's what planets means. They're wandering backwards against the sky. And not only are they wandering backwards, sometimes they slow down and then they go the other way. That's what astrologers mean when they say station and retrograde. Stationing is when it's slowing down. Retrograde is when it looks like it's moving backwards. And so that indicated to these early astronomers and philosophers that they didn't have all the information. And so this led to a quest. It was put out by Plato in some of his writings, this quest calling on all future philosophers and mathematicians and astronomers and astrologers to solve the problem of the planets. And the problem of the planets was this wandering motion, these retrogrades, and they kept trying to figure it out. Ptolemy had an extraordinary model that had circles with what are called epicycles, and it got more and more complex until Copernicus said, figured out that the sun was at the center, which was actually an ancient hypothesis, and coming out of Greece. There's some evidence too that um, that was understood in, I think, among the Inca. So there was an emergence much earlier in several ancient civilizations that the sun was at the center. But Copernicus wrote his treatise on that, and it's what we call the Copernican Revolution. And then the mathematics were actually figured out by Kepler, who realized, oh, they're not perfect circles, which is what they'd all been trying to do, because the perfect circle is the divine shape. It is a perfect shape. They're not circles, they're ellipses, and that they have two focal points instead of one, and that the sun is at the center of one of those focal points. So it's amazing what retrogrades have inspired in terms of human knowledge, because it's that perception that the divine in the heavens must be perfect, so they can't be wandering. And it's that need to understand, to understand the divinity of the cosmos, that inspired this 2,000-year quest to understand why it is the planets do what they do. And I tend to think of retrograde periods as honoring that quest, whether it's Mercury going retrograde or Venus. It's a concentration of whatever archetypal quality is associated with Mercury, Venus, Saturn, whatever planet it is that's retrograde. A lot of planets are retrograde right now. Saturn, Jupiter, Pluto, they're all retrograde along with Venus. But it's this reminder, I think, a kind of going back over of how extraordinary it is that we can have these calculations, that I can sit here and tell you this is where these planets are going to be on these days, and we can predict their motion, and therefore we can have some kind of archetypal prediction of what the quality of time will be like going forward. So that is that's a little bit on the Mercury retrograde coming up, and of course the Venus retrograde that we're still in the midst of, very much in the midst of. Venus is also making 3 squares to Neptune during that time. It did one already, as you would have heard me talk about last time if you were here. On May 3rd was the first Venus square to Neptune. The second one was just yesterday, so we're very much still in the orb of that, and there'll be another one later in the summer. But Venus with Neptune, it's ethereal, it's magical, it's the fairy tale romance, it's our ideals in love and relationship, and it has this kind of otherworldly, enchanted quality to it. It can kind of cast a magical glow on falling in love or on our heart connections with somebody. And it also, I find, can really shape our perception of beauty. I personally have been noticing this with each exact alignment of Venus with Neptune, that when I look outside, for example, it's almost like there's this gossamer enchanted filter over the world where the light is just that much more beautiful, or our perception of the colors is that much more delicate and attuned. I actually got to have a really extraordinary expression of the Venus Neptune on the day that it was exact, of or the day before it was exact, but it's very much still in orb. It's just kind of passing really, really close because Venus stationed in a tight square to Neptune. So that Venus square Neptune that I'm describing has been dominating these last couple of weeks in terms of the archetypal quality. And I've already been noticing it so much where it's just like, wow, the world just feels so beautiful right now in this kind of spring expression. And then the day before this next exact alignment, I got to see this amazing double rainbow. For those of you who are here in the Nevada City area, it was like a double rainbow with the brighter rainbow had 5 layers of rainbows kind of reverberating into this otherworldly dimension. I've never seen a rainbow like that. It was like being on a psychedelic without being on a psychedelic, just looking at this rainbow. So I feel very blessed to have been able to see that particular expression. But I want to encourage you, as we are in this transit, of notice how you're observing things. Notice what you find beautiful. Is it especially beautiful right now? Does it have a kind of exquisite, ethereal, almost sacred glow to it? And I'm speaking to a lot of the really lovely sides of Venus Neptune. There are challenging sides to it as well. Venus Neptune can be the illusion or the delusion within a relationship. It can be idealizing someone and then just having that idealization totally shatter because no one can live up to being a perfect angel, even if we want them to, or even if we expect it of them. So there can be that illusory quality with Venus Neptune as well. And so we do have to be kind of mindful in the midst of a Venus Neptune transit like this that we're in the middle of right now, of are we deluding ourselves? Are we trusting in something that's maybe just ephemeral, that isn't solid and real, or that isn't really grounded fully? So again, these are important shadow potentials to keep in mind with this particular alignment. And because Venus will pass square to Neptune one more time when it's going direct, this is a long Venus Neptune transit, and that those themes that I've been describing may feel kind of wave in and out of presence throughout these next couple months. We have about 10 minutes left together, and I do want to make sure there is space for anyone who might have questions, who hasn't asked them yet. If you're the type of person who is maybe shy about asking questions, or you have one that's popping up within you and you just, oh, you can't bear yourself to ask, I would encourage you to lean into that feeling and ask it, but no pressure, of course. Well, the space is always open. You're always most welcome to ask anything clarifying, anything practical, technical, or mythological. Um, so the I am seeing one practical question, which was, will we get this recording via email as well? And I will be posting the recording on um, my website, which is just beccatarnas.com. And it's available through my YouTube channel. I will also be sharing it with the wonderful people at Ouroboros, and they can do what they would like with it. I don't know if that means it will go out via email or not. But it'll definitely be accessible through beccatarnas.com. It's just my name. Let me just put that here in the chat so you have that. And the other thing I will mention, I misspelled my own name. That's amazing. That's right. The number of times I'm typing Becca really quickly and I write Nexa or Vixa. So those are alternate names for me, apparently. And so also available at my website, if you haven't already discovered this, I write out descriptions for each of the transits throughout the lunation. So I've got maybe 20 for a month or so. And I send that out to my email list, and I also post it on my website. So you can access the whole list there. you'll be able to kind of touch back in with a lot of the information that I've been talking about here today. So if you can't keep track of all these dates or all these specific alignments and you don't want to have to go back through a video to catch it, the highlights and more as well are written out there. So again, you can get that through the website, or if you're already on my mailing list or you've had an astrology reading with me, then you'll get it there. But the other way that I send those out, other than it going out in bulk for the whole lunation, is that I post them on my various social media accounts. So whether you're on Instagram or Twitter or whatever mercurial place you find yourself, I make those available there as well. And if you do access the one through the website where you have it all at once, I do have a couple recommendations of how to work with it. I think it's really helpful to maybe print it out, for example, and keep it with your calendar. And you can check back in with that either as the day is approaching and thinking, how do I want to prepare for this day? How do I want to work intentionally with this energy? So you can do it in that kind of more proactive, participatory way. Or you can do it as a way to reflect and be able to, look back on the day by going over what has been written about it. I think there's benefits to both. There's a benefit to planning, but I think there's also maybe even a deeper benefit to integrating, looking back over things. Yeah, please.
It sounds like, since this is the Gemini Lunation cycle, and there's all this Mercury influence, that it's probably is a good time to do some detailed planning. The
Mm-hmm.
world shifting, the way we want to move into the future is something we need to be thinking about. And, maybe there are some details that we can dream on this month.
That's a really great way of putting it. Details to dream on. Because especially with the new moon setting in with Mercury and Venus squared in Neptune, the dreamy piece is going to be there. And even though, yes, it's really mercurial, it's hard to get it. It's slippery. So it's like planning, but with a flow, planning with flexibility, being adaptable, and, being like the, um, bamboo in the wind or something like that, so you can kind of be a little bit more flexible with things.
And
So
just letting some images come into your mind about how certain things might piece together eventually.
in the long term, beyond this month.
Yeah, the world is really different. It's going to be different. I hear people say, "Oh, when this is over, nothing's over. We evolve.
Right.
We
Yeah.
we come through, and then we're this way." And people are having different things with their kids, and the details of our lives are really different. And whether we're driving or not driving, or school at home or school somewhere else, or we don't even, lots of things are changing,
Yeah.
and that affects how we move through our lives. And we can't really see what's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, there's a few things that I can say about that here in these last few minutes, and I do think it is connected to the larger outer planetary transit alignments, particularly that Saturn Pluto conjunction I mentioned. Saturn Pluto started to come into alignment at the beginning of 2018. And it tightened in through 2019. It touched exact in January of 2020. And it's going to continue to be in a very tight alignment throughout this year with Jupiter involved. And we're really, I think, feeling that the contraction, the crunch in. And it will continue to be in alignment next year, 2021, which just makes sense if you think of it from an economic perspective, a political perspective, an epidemiological perspective. It doesn't seem likely that the situation that we are in at all of those levels is just suddenly going to be over, especially considering it in the context of those transits. And I do think, based on actually the motion of Mars coming through in September, that September through January is actually going to probably look a lot like March and April of this year. Maybe a different turn of the spiral, a different octave of it, but archetypally the themes are very similar of Mars with Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto. Mars is at a different hard angle to those planets, but it's involved. It ignites, it inflames what it touches. We saw that in March and April as this whole crisis unfolded very quickly. And I think we're going to see a repetition of that in some form through the fall and early winter. And then things start to change as we move into next year. We still have the Saturn Pluto context, that contraction, but there's also space for sudden change, sudden breakdown and breakthrough as Uranus and Jupiter come more tightly into the mix. So I think we are going to be seeing the endings of a lot of things, the birth of new beginnings, new possibilities, a lot of innovation for better or worse, particularly probably around like December, January, but carrying through next year. The picture after 2021, basically after the Saturn Pluto comes out of alignment, we are going to be in a different world. Saturn Pluto tends to leave a lasting mark, a lasting change on the world. And we can just see that when we look back historically. Both world wars changed the world. 9/11 changed the world, not just this country, because of our response to it. The economic recession of the last Saturn Pluto square, which 2008 to 2011, that changed a lot. Not only did it change a lot, it set a lot of the situations up that we're in the midst of now and seeing the fallout of. So Saturn Pluto is very critical, very crucial, and the full motion of what we are within is not yet over. Something I've been saying recently is we are still in the middle of the story. And when you are in the middle of the story, you don't know how it's going to end. Yes, there can be fear, there can be heaviness, darkness, challenge, hopelessness even, but stories do change and they do come to a different outcome. But it wouldn't be a story if we didn't live through it, if we didn't fully embrace that. And I think in some ways you can think of this eclipse season coming through as those cycles happening in miniature. What does it feel like to be in the middle of the darkness of the story in the middle of this month?
And then the Jupiter Saturn conjunction setting off that whole new air thing.
Yeah. A great subject for one of our next times coming together. Thank you all so much for coming. We are at the end of our time together, and we'll be meeting again for the Cancer Lunation Cycle and talking more about this, because that will be leading up to that solar eclipse. And I want to wish you all well. May you be healthy and well and mindful in your communications, because my goodness, is communication not the theme of this lunation. It was such a pleasure getting to speak with all of you. And if you do have any further questions that come up, you can contact me again through that website, and I'm more than happy to answer questions or point you toward further resources or anything else. And I hope to see a lot of you a month from now.